The night air above Karafuto was still, heavy with the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The summer of 1945 had been unkind to Japan, but in this corner of its northern frontier, far from the firebombed ruins of Tokyo or Osaka, there remained an illusion of safety. The villages scattered along the Sakhalin rail lines continued their routine. Trains rattled through the darkness, carrying timber from the forests, coal from the mines, and soldiers and civilians alike who still believed that the home islands remained beyond the reach of American attack. But on the evening of July 23rd, that fragile illusion shattered in an instant. Shortly after midnight, the rumble of a locomotive could be felt before it was heard. A string of freight cars clattered over the tracks, their steel wheels grinding against the iron rails. Lamps from the engine cast a yellow glow across the line, illuminating patches of brush and the occasional wooden crossing. Villagers in their homes nearby turned over in restless sleep as the sound of the passing train drifted through the night. Then, without warning, the calm was ripped apart. A thunderous explosion tore upward from the tracks. The locomotive's front wheels struck a hidden charge, and in less than a second, hundreds of pounds of steel, timber, and burning coal were hurled into the air. The engine pitched violently, as though lifted by an unseen hand, and came crashing down in a storm of sparks and splintered iron. Freight cars behind it buckled and overturned, some piling onto one another, others tearing loose and derailing in twisted ruin. The earth itself seemed to quake. For miles the blast carried across valleys and into the hills, echoing like distant thunder rolling through Karafuto's forests. Those awakened by the blast stumbled into the streets to see the night sky lit orange by fire. Columns of black smoke twisted upward, illuminated by the flickering flames of burning cargo. Cries rang out, some from trapped passengers, others from villagers rushing toward the wreckage. To Japanese railway guards and civil defense units, the scene was incomprehensible. Trains derailed often enough by accident, but this was no accident. The tracks had been deliberately sabotaged. What remained of the rail line was bent and broken, its steel rails twisted into grotesque shapes. A section of earth beneath the line had been blown apart, leaving a crater wide enough to swallow a man whole. As rescue workers scrambled, the questions began almost immediately. How could this have happened here, on Japanese soil? The Americans had bombed from the sky. They had shelled from the sea, but no one imagined that foreign soldiers would set foot upon the homeland itself. Yet the evidence lay before them. Someone had laid explosives on the tracks, timed with precision to strike at the exact moment a train rolled overhead. Word spread quickly. Authorities dispatched investigators. Locals whispered about strange movements near the shoreline in the hours before the blast. Fishermen recalled unusual lights offshore, as if a vessel lingered in the darkness. None of them yet knew the truth, that only hours earlier, a handful of American sailors, not Marines or paratroopers, but men of the U.S. Navy's submarine service, had crept ashore under cover of night. They carried with them a homemade explosive charge designed to detonate under the weight of a train. Their mission had been brief but daring, and within minutes of planting the device, they had vanished again into the darkness, paddling back to a waiting submarine hidden beyond the surf. For the Japanese military, the implications were devastating. If American commandos could strike here, on Karafuto, what other corner of the empire was safe? If saboteurs could land on their soil under the very noses of coastal defenses, could they not land anywhere? Panic simmered beneath the surface. Official reports would later downplay the event, but among those who saw the wreckage firsthand, the message was unmistakable. The war had reached the homeland in a new and humiliating way. For the men of the USS Barb, watching from offshore, the sight was unforgettable. From the conning tower of the submarine, sailors peered through binoculars as the train thundered into view. They held their breath as it rolled across the section of track where their comrades had planted the charge. Then came the detonation, the eruption of fire and steel, and the unmistakable sight of a Japanese locomotive leaping off the rails in a blossom of smoke. A cheer went up aboard the submarine, tempered by the need for silence. The mission had succeeded beyond expectation. The raiders had returned, the charge had worked, and the impossible had been achieved. An American attack carried out on Japanese home territory. It was, in strict terms, a small tactical event. One train destroyed, one stretch of rail disrupted. Compared to the firestorms that consumed Tokyo, the thousands of tons of bombs dropped on industrial centers, or the looming prospect of invasion, the sabotage at Karafuto might seem insignificant. Yet symbolism in war can be as powerful as material destruction. For the Japanese, the wrecked locomotive was more than metal. It was a sign that their vaunted isolation had been breached. For the Americans, it was proof that daring, imagination, and audacity could carry the fight even into the enemy's heartland. The scene that night in July of 1945 was the culmination of months of planning, years of submarine warfare, and the vision of a commander unwilling to accept the limits of conventional tactics. To understand how this single explosion on a remote rail line became a legend in naval history, we must turn back to the submarine that made it possible, and to the man whose name became synonymous with audacity in the Pacific War, Commander Eugene B. Fluckey of the USS Barb. This story is not merely of one explosion in the night, but of the long journey that led to it. The evolution of submarine warfare, the tightening grip of America's naval blockade, the desperate defense of Japan, and the ingenuity of a crew who dared to attempt what others thought impossible. The wreckage on the rails of Karafuto was more than an isolated act of sabotage. It was a signal flare announcing the war's inevitable conclusion, a foretaste of the total defeat that awaited Japan in the summer of 1945. And so, as flames consumed the wreckage and the stunned villagers gathered in silence, history had been made. The question that echoes still is how it came to pass, how an American submarine, lurking in enemy waters, could land commandos on Japanese soil, destroy a train, and escape into the night. To answer that, we must step back from the moment of explosion and trace the path that brought the USS Barb and her commander to the shores of Karafuto. It is a story of relentless war beneath the waves, of commanders willing to gamble everything, and of a singular mission that stunned an empire already staggering under the weight of defeat. The USS Barb began her service in the dark years of the Pacific War, when the United States Navy was still struggling to recover from the blows of December 7, 1941. Commissioned in July 1942, she was one of the new Gato-class submarines, long, lean, and deadly, built to carry the war to Japan's shipping lanes. Displacing more than 1,500 tons when surfaced and nearly 2,500 submerged, the Barb stretched just over 311 feet, with a beam of 27 feet. She could dive to depths of 300 feet and carried 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, backed by deck guns for surface action. Like her sisters, she was designed for endurance, able to patrol thousands of miles from Pearl Harbor or Fremantle, slipping through narrow straits and lurking in shallow waters where mistakes could mean annihilation. The early war years tested the submarine force brutally. American torpedoes were plagued by faulty detonators and unreliable depth control. Japanese anti-submarine tactics grew sharper, and the losses mounted. But the submarine service persisted, gradually honing the tactics that would strangle Japan's maritime lifelines. The USS Barb was part of this evolution, learning her trade in the heat of combat, under a series of commanders who shaped her crew into a hardened band of sailors. Yet it was not until January 1944, when a new skipper took command, that the Barb would truly begin her ascent into legend. That skipper was Commander Eugene Bennett Fluckey. Fluckey, born in Washington, D.C. in 1913, had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1935. By the time war broke out, he had already served aboard surface ships and completed submarine training, developing a reputation as resourceful, restless, and deeply ambitious. His fellow officers nicknamed him Lucky Flucky, partly in jest, but partly in recognition of a remarkable streak of fortune that seemed to follow him into battle. But luck alone did not define him. He possessed a rare combination of daring and discipline, a willingness to improvise on the fly, and a charisma that inspired intense loyalty from his men. When Flucky assumed command of the Barb, he found a boat already blooded in war, but not yet exceptional. He resolved to change that. His approach to leadership was both rigorous and unconventional. He demanded absolute precision in drills and battle routines, but he also encouraged initiative and ingenuity among his crew. He took the time to know his men, to listen to their ideas, and to instill in them a belief that their submarine could achieve feats no one else dared attempt. In the unforgiving world of undersea warfare, where a single error could doom the entire boat, this trust between commander and crew became their greatest strength. On her subsequent patrols under Flucky's command, the Barb became a predator of rare skill. She prowled Japanese shipping lanes with relentless aggression, sinking merchantmen and troop transports, tankers and freighters. Each kill was another strand cut from Japan's already fraying supply web. Flucky pushed his boat into shallow waters where few dared to venture, close to harbors bristling with defenses. In one famous patrol off China's coast, he maneuvered the Barb into Namquan Harbor itself, threading through minefields and shoals under the cover of darkness. There, with torpedoes primed, the Barb unleashed a devastating strike against a convoy at anchor. 8 ships were left wrecked or sinking, and when Japanese destroyers came hunting, Flucky coolly extricated his submarine through the same treacherous waters by which he had entered. For this feat alone, he would later be awarded the Medal of Honor. Yet the Barb's reputation was not merely built on firepower. Flucky innovated constantly. He experimented with new approaches to gunnery, to torpedo tactics, to evasive maneuvers under depth-charge attack. He encouraged his men to think beyond the manuals, to devise ways of fighting that bent the rules without breaking them. The crew came to see themselves as a uniquely capable team, capable of anything, and this esprit de corps radiated from their commander. Where others saw limits, Flucky saw opportunities. The statistics tell only part of the story. Over the course of her 12 patrols, the Barb sank 17 enemy ships totaling nearly 97,000 tons and damaged many more. She destroyed sampans, barges, and trawlers that supply Puishcheya, Japan's garrisons scattered across the Pacific. She shelled shore installations, bombarded fuel dumps, and harassed convoys along coastal waters thought too dangerous for American submarines. Her battle flag bristled with symbols of destruction: merchant ships, tankers, warships, and soon enough, a locomotive. But it was the personality of Flucky himself that set the tone. He was a commander who believed that audacity was a weapon, and that imagination could tip the balance of war. Where others measured success in tonnage sunk, he measured it in the impact of surprise, in the psychological shock delivered to the enemy, and in the boldness with which his men executed their missions. His official reports, though couched in the formal language of the Navy, carried a spirit of pride and defiance. Unofficially, his crew adored him. Many would later recall that they would have followed him into any danger, confident that if anyone could bring them back alive, it was Lucky Flucky. As the Pacific War dragged into 1945, the Barb's patrols became ever more daring. Japan's merchant fleet was dwindling rapidly, convoys heavily guarded, and targets harder to find. Submarines were increasingly pushed to the edges of conventional tactics, compelled to innovate or be rendered irrelevant. Flucky understood this better than most. He believed that the submarine was not merely a weapon of stealth, but a platform for creative, unconventional strikes. It was this mindset that led him to contemplate a mission no other commander would have dared propose: to land a raiding party on Japanese soil itself. The idea took root during the Barb's 12th patrol, launched from the Marianas in June 1945. Flucky knew that every action now carried heightened symbolic weight. The war was drawing to a close, but Japan remained defiant. Cities burned under the B-29s. The Navy was shattered, and yet the Empire clung to its last strongholds. To strike directly at the homeland, to place American sailors on its soil, would be to send a message more potent than any single sinking. It would demonstrate that nowhere was safe, that the reach of American arms was absolute, and that the Empire's defenses were crumbling. To understand why such a mission could even be considered, one must recognize the foundation laid by Fluckey's earlier successes. Without his track record of victories, without the trust of his crew, without the reputation for resourcefulness that preceded him, the very idea of putting men ashore in enemy territory would have been unthinkable. But aboard the Barb, the extraordinary had already become routine. Her men had seen harbors penetrated, convoys annihilated, and miracles of survival achieved. When their commander hinted at an even more audacious plan, few doubted his resolve. Thus, the stage was set. The USS Barb, already among the most decorated submarines in the U.S. Navy, was about to carve her name into history not merely as a predator beneath the seas, but as the platform for the only American ground combat operation on Japanese soil during the entire Second World War. At the center of it all stood Commander Eugene B. Fluckey, fearless, inventive, and unwilling to accept the ordinary boundaries of naval warfare. His belief that imagination was as vital as firepower would soon lead him and his crew to an act that stunned an empire. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese Empire stood on the edge of collapse. What had begun in December 1941 as a triumphant surge across the Pacific and Southeast Asia had, in less than 4 years, been reduced to a struggle for survival within the very borders of the home islands. The victories of the Imperial Navy at Pearl Harbor, the swift conquests of Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines, and the march through the Dutch East Indies were now distant memories. In their place were ruins, cities reduced to ash, fleets sunk in shallow harbors, and armies stranded and starving in distant garrisons cut off by Allied blockades. American strategy had worked with grinding precision. Operation Galvanic in the Gilberts, Operation Flintlock in the Marshalls, Operation Forager in the Marianas. Each campaign leapfrogged westward, bypassing strongholds, isolating them, and leaving them to wither. By late 1944, the capture of the Marianas placed the Japanese heartland within reach of the Boeing B-29 superfortress. From bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, fleets of bombers launched unrelenting attacks on Japanese industry and cities. In March 1945, Operation Meeting House set Tokyo ablaze in a single night of firebombing, killing an estimated 100,000 civilians. In the months that followed, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other cities suffered the same fate. The urban landscape of Japan became a wasteland of ashes, corpses, and refugees. At sea, Japan's shipping lifeline was strangled beyond recovery. The submarine campaign of the U.S. Navy had destroyed merchant shipping at a staggering rate. By mid-1945, nearly 8 million tons of Japanese merchant vessels had been sunk, over 60% of the pre-war fleet. Tankers that once carried oil from the Dutch East Indies were gone, leaving the Japanese Navy immobilized. The once mighty combined fleet, centerpiece of imperial power, had been reduced to hulks anchored at Kure, awaiting destruction from the air. The battleship Yamato, pride of the fleet, had been sunk in April 1945 during Operation Ten-Go, a one-way sortie that ended beneath the waves off Okinawa. The war on land was no better. In the Philippines, General Yamashita's forces had been crushed in Manila and Luzon. In Burma, British and Indian forces advanced relentlessly. In China, the Japanese army was stretched thin and bleeding from years of attrition. At Okinawa, from April to June 1945, the last major battle had ended in catastrophe. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed, and thousands of civilians dead in mass suicides or bombardments. For the first time in the war, the Japanese had fought on territory considered part of the home islands, and they had been annihilated. In this context of defeat and looming invasion, the northern frontier of Karafuto, or southern Sakhalin Island, retained a peculiar status. Annexed by Japan after the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, Karafuto was both colony and homeland. It held industries, mines, and railroads vital to the empire's northern economy. Trains transported coal and timber, soldiers and civilians, along its rail lines with clockwork regularity. Compared to Tokyo or Osaka, Karafuto was a backwater, and for that reason, many believed it was safe. The Soviet Union, though neutral under the 1941 Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, loomed only a short distance across the Amur River and the Siberian frontier. Yet in July 1945, with Germany defeated, Stalin's armies were preparing in secret for an assault into Manchuria and beyond. The Japanese garrison in Karafuto watched uneasily, but official assurances insisted that the northern frontier was secure. Unlike the great southern ports, Karafuto's railways had not been bombed, its towns had not been incinerated, and its villages remained intact. Supply trains still clattered along the tracks, their whistles echoing across valleys. To soldiers stationed there, Karafuto seemed one of the last untouched pieces of the empire. This illusion of security was critical to Japanese morale. Even as B-29s burned the great cities to cinders, many believed that the northern frontier remained out of reach, beyond the operational grasp of the United States Navy. No American aircraft carriers prowled the frigid seas of the northern Pacific. No Marines prepared landings on Karafuto's shores. The trains rolled on, delivering coal, timber, and troops to Hokkaido and beyond. Yet the reality was far bleaker than Tokyo admitted. Japanese intelligence knew that American submarines operated even in these waters, cutting off shipping and hunting convoys. Patrol boats and shore batteries tried to guard the coasts, but their resources were stretched thin. Food shortages grew worse each month. Civilian life was marked by ration cards, malnutrition, and fear of air raids. Children carried bamboo spears in mandatory civil defense drills, preparing for the invasion they were told was inevitable. By July 1945, Japan's leaders faced an impossible choice. The military faction, dominated by hardline generals, insisted on fighting to the death, hoping to secure better terms through sheer sacrifice. Others urged surrender before further destruction. Behind closed doors, Emperor Hirohito himself expressed doubts about continuing the war, but his advisors hesitated to confront the army. Meanwhile, the Allies prepared Operation Downfall, a massive two-stage invasion of Kyushu and Honshu scheduled to begin that autumn. If launched, it promised casualties in the millions. Into this desperate atmosphere came the USS Barb and her commander, Eugene Fluckey. By themselves, one submarine and its crew could not alter the fate of the war. The atomic bombs and Soviet entry would ultimately decide Japan's surrender. Yet symbolism mattered enormously in this moment. Every strike, every incursion, every sign that Japan's defenses were hollow carried psychological weight. The Japanese government had long insisted that the homeland was inviolable, that foreign troops would never set foot on sacred soil. If that belief was shattered, the myth of security would collapse along with it. This is why the sabotage of a single train in Karafuto carried significance far beyond its material effect. One train destroyed would not stop Japan's war machine, but the fact that Americans had landed, undetected, planted explosives, and escaped, that fact alone was devastating. It meant that no place was beyond reach, not even the remote railways of the northern frontier. It signaled to Japanese civilians that the empire could not protect them, and to Japanese soldiers that the homeland itself had become a battlefield. Thus, as the summer of 1945 reached its climax, with atomic fire soon to descend on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and with Soviet armies preparing to strike into Manchuria, the stage was set for one of the most daring commando actions of the Pacific War. On a shoreline of Karafuto, under the cover of darkness, 8 American sailors would step onto Japanese soil. Their mission was small, almost trivial in military terms: to sabotage a rail line and destroy a passing train. But its symbolism would echo far beyond the rails of Sakhalin. It would be remembered not for the tonnage destroyed, but for the audacity, for the breach of homeland security, and for the way it revealed that Japan's empire was no longer merely crumbling. It was broken. By July of 1945, the USS Barb had already secured her place among the most successful American submarines of the Pacific War. But Commander Eugene B. Fluckey was not content with records or accolades. As the Barb embarked on her 12th war patrol, sailing north into the frigid waters around the Japanese home islands, Fluckey was thinking beyond the usual tally of merchant ships and convoys. He was contemplating a strike so unusual, so audacious, that it would redefine what a submarine could do in modern war. The idea was simple in conception, yet radical in practice. To put American sailors ashore on Japanese soil, to carry out sabotage against the enemy's transportation network, and to return safely to the submarine without leaving a trace. No U.S. submarine commander had ever attempted such an act. The very thought carried grave risks. The shoreline of the home islands was patrolled by soldiers, guarded by lookouts, and watched by coastal batteries. Inland police and gendarmes maintained vigilance for any hint of espionage or subversion. To be captured ashore meant not only death, but torture and humiliation at the hands of the enemy. And yet, for Fluckey, the potential reward outweighed the peril. Why did he consider such a plan at all? The answer lies in the state of the war in mid-1945. Japanese shipping was already decimated. Merchant convoys were scarce and heavily defended. Submarines often returned with fewer kills, their patrols marked by long days of searching empty seas. Fluckey understood that the strategic effect of submarine warfare was already achieved. Japan's industry was strangled. To make an impact now required more than torpedoes. It required imagination. Fluckey's mind turned to the railways of Karafuto, the southern half of Sakhalin Island. This territory, under Japanese control since 1905, possessed active rail lines carrying coal, timber, soldiers, and supplies. Unlike the shattered transportation networks of Honshu and Kyushu, Karafuto's trains still ran with some regularity. Destroying one would not cripple the empire, but it would send a symbolic shockwave to demonstrate that Americans could strike not merely from the sky, but from the very soil of Japan itself, would carry weight far beyond the wreckage of a single locomotive. The first step was to convince his crew. Fluckey called his officers together and outlined the concept. A small party would land at night in rubber boats, carrying a specially rigged explosive charge. They would advance inland, locate a stretch of track, and plant the device. A train passing over the mechanism would trigger the explosion, derailing cars and destroying the line. The sailors would then retreat to the beach, rejoin their boat, and return to the submarine before dawn. The entire operation would take no more than a few hours, but in those hours, the fate of the raiders would hang by a thread. There was no hesitation among his men. When Fluckey asked for volunteers, hands shot up across the wardroom. The sailors of the Barb had followed their commander into harbors mined and patrolled, had endured depth charge attacks, and had seen the impossible accomplished before. They trusted his judgment and relished the chance to be part of something unprecedented. Fluckey selected 8 men, strong swimmers, steady under pressure, and trusted for their discipline. Among them were machinists' mates, torpedomen, and signalmen, ordinary sailors thrust into the role of commandos. The next challenge was technical. How could they construct an explosive that would detonate under the weight of a train? The answer came from improvisation. Using materials available aboard the submarine, the crew assembled a device consisting of a demolition charge rigged with a pressure switch. Wooden planks, nails, and wiring were fashioned into a crude but effective mechanism. When the heavy wheels of a locomotive pressed down, the circuit would close, triggering the explosion. It was not elegant, but it was deadly. With the weapon prepared, Fluckey turned to the question of location. The Barb prowled the coasts of Karafuto, using periscope and binoculars to scout potential landing sites. The shoreline was rugged, with rocky beaches and steep bluffs. Villages dotted the coast, their lights faint against the dark. Trains could be heard at intervals, their whistles echoing across the night. Eventually, Flucky identified a stretch of track near the town of Shari, close to the shoreline, lightly guarded, and accessible from the sea. Here, the raiding party could land, move inland quickly, and reach the line without drawing attention. The risks remained formidable. If the raiders were detected, the consequences would be dire. The Japanese had coastal patrols and local garrisons. Villagers could raise the alarm at the sight of strangers. Even if the men succeeded in planting the device, returning undetected to the submarine posed another hurdle. Timing was everything. The operation required perfect coordination, the submarine surfacing at the right moment, the raiders launching and recovering swiftly, and all completed under the cloak of darkness. Flucky weighed these dangers and made his decision. The plan would proceed. He presented it in his War Patrol report, framing it as an extension of aggressive submarine tactics. Officially, no approval from higher command was sought or required. Submarine skippers enjoyed wide latitude in their patrol areas, but Flucky understood the magnitude of what he was attempting. If it succeeded, it would be hailed as a bold stroke. If it failed, it might be remembered as a reckless gamble that cost men's lives needlessly. As the days passed, anticipation grew aboard the Barb. Sailors speculated about the mission, teased the volunteers about their shore leave, and worked tirelessly to ensure that every detail was perfected. The selected raiders rehearsed quietly, practicing with the rubber boats, reviewing the layout of the explosive, and memorizing their assignments. They understood that discovery meant not only their own deaths, but potentially the safety of the entire submarine. Secrecy and discipline were paramount. Flucky himself carried the burden of command with calm determination. In his later writings, he admitted that the thought of losing men to capture haunted him, but he trusted in their skill and in the element of surprise. He reminded his crew that they had already defied the odds time and again. This, he told them, would be no different. In the final days before the raid, the Barb patrolled off Karafuto, watching trains roll along the shoreline, their whistles piercing the cold night air. The target was close, the plan was ready, and the moment approached. For the 8 men who would go ashore, it would be the most dangerous assignment of their lives. For Commander Eugene Flucky, it was the culmination of his belief that audacity and imagination were as vital as torpedoes in the war against Japan. What lay ahead was unprecedented. The only ground combat mission carried out on Japanese soil by the U.S. Navy in the entire war. A handful of sailors would step into history, armed not with rifles, but with a single explosive charge and the daring of their commander. The Barb had already sunk ships and shelled coasts. Now, under Flucky's bold proposal, she was about to strike directly at the Empire's heart, not from the depths, but from the land itself. When Commander Eugene Flucky first unveiled his daring plan to strike at Japan's railways, it was not to be executed by the submarine's torpedoes or deck guns, but by a small band of men who would step ashore under cover of night. To carry out this audacious mission, he would need volunteers, sailors willing to risk everything for an operation with no precedent, no margin for error, and no guarantee of survival. The call went out aboard the USS Barb, and the response was immediate. Hands shot up across the crew. Men who had spent years beneath the seas, braving depth charges and patrol boats, leapt at the chance to do something utterly different, to set foot on enemy soil, even if only for a few hours. Flucky faced the opposite problem of most commanders. He had too many willing volunteers. He selected 8, balancing skill, composure, and physical endurance. They would become the raiding party that history would remember. The chosen men were a cross-section of the submarine service. Machinist's mate 3rd Class Billy Hatfield, Torpedo Man 2nd Class Paul Saunders, Signalman 2nd Class Francis Seve, Motor Machinist's mate 2nd Class Edward Klingler, and 4 others, each with his own role. They were not Marines, not trained commandos, but ordinary sailors thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Their weapons were not rifles or grenades, but ingenuity, stealth, and the confidence of their commander. Training for the mission began immediately. The submarine's narrow decks and cramped compartments became the classroom and drill ground. The men practiced launching and paddling the small rubber boats that would ferry them ashore, learning to move silently over the surf. They drilled on how to disembark quickly, how to distribute their equipment, and how to blend into the night. Every sound, every movement was rehearsed, for even a splash too loud might betray them to shore patrols. The centerpiece of their preparation was the bomb itself, a pressure-triggered demolition charge designed to detonate under the immense weight of a locomotive. Using spare parts, batteries, and wiring from the submarine stores, the sailors fashioned a device both crude and ingenious. A plank of wood, embedded with nails and fitted with a micro-switch, formed the trigger. When laid across the rails and covered with ballast, it would be invisible to a casual glance. The passing train, heavy with coal, troops, or supplies, would complete the circuit, sending current to the explosive charge and detonating it with devastating effect. Flucky oversaw the construction with meticulous care, ensuring that the mechanism was simple enough to be reliable, yet powerful enough to do the job. The charge itself was compact, but when coupled with the speed and mass of a moving train, the results would be catastrophic. Tests aboard the submarine's deck, silent, careful simulations, confirmed its function. The men handled the bomb with a mixture of reverence and unease, knowing that one misstep could end their mission before it began. As the days passed, the human dimension of the mission revealed itself. The 8 sailors, though hardened by years of war, were still young, most in their early 20s. They joked to cover their nerves, teasing one another about who would run the fastest back to the beach or who would have the steadiest hand when wiring the charge. Yet beneath the humor was the sober awareness of what they faced. Capture meant torture, perhaps execution, and certainly no rescue. They would be the first Americans to land on Japanese soil during the war, and they would do so without uniforms, without the protection of an army, with nothing but silence and speed to shield them. In rare, quiet moments, some wrote brief notes or letters, unsure if they would return. Others cleaned their gear with ritual precision, as if mastery over the smallest details might tip the scales in their favor. On the mess deck, comrades not chosen for the raid offered them extra rations or clapped them on the shoulder with wordless encouragement. The entire submarine felt the weight of what was about to happen. Commander Flucky maintained his characteristic calm. He reminded the men that their mission was not only daring, but symbolic. "We strike not for destruction alone," he told them, "but to show the enemy that his soil is no refuge." His words carried gravity. The crew knew their commander never wasted lives. If he believed the mission could succeed, then success was possible. The sailors practiced navigation in the cramped submarine corridors, memorizing the short route from beach to track and back again. They rehearsed signals with flashlights covered by cloth, practiced lifting and carrying the bomb, and studied the map of Karafuto's coastline drawn from periscope observations. Each man was assigned a role. 2 would carry the bomb, 2 would dig and prepare the site, 2 would provide lookout, and the remaining pair would secure the path of retreat. As the submarine crept closer to Karafuto, the atmosphere aboard tightened with anticipation. Every creak of the hull, every ping of the sonar carried new weight. The men chosen for the raid lay awake in their bunks, listening to the hiss of air recyclers, imagining the night ahead. They were sailors trained for the depths, but soon they would crawl across enemy soil with nothing but a black sky overhead. On the eve of the mission, the crew gathered in subdued camaraderie. The raiders checked their equipment one final time. The rubber boats, the paddles, the demolition charge. They blackened their faces with grease, a crude camouflage against the moonlight. Flucky himself inspected each man, his words brief but steady. "Do your duty and return." There was no illusion about the risks. Japanese coastal patrols were real. Villagers might hear them, and the bomb might fail. Yet the men carried themselves with quiet resolve. They knew that what they were about to attempt would be remembered, not merely by their shipmates, but by history itself. When dawn came, the submarine slipped farther out to sea, submerging by day and surfacing again by night. The chosen landing site was observed carefully. Through the periscope, the crew watched trains clattering along the tracks, their whistles echoing in the cold night air. Each passing locomotive was a reminder of the mission's stakes and of the moment soon to come. The raiding party was ready. They were ordinary sailors no longer confined to the steel belly of a submarine, but volunteers about to step into the annals of naval warfare. The pressure trigger bomb lay waiting, compact yet deadly, the fruit of improvisation and determination. And in their minds echoed the knowledge that they would be the first Americans to land and strike on the soil of Japan itself. The night of July 23, 1945, was moonless off the coast of Karafuto. The USS Barb rose silently from the depths, her ballast tanks blowing with a low hiss, breaking the stillness of the dark sea. The men on deck spoke in whispers, their eyes straining toward the outline of the distant shoreline. There, faint against the horizon, lay the target, the quiet Japanese coast, fringed with forests and cut by a single thread of railway that fed the empire's northern lifeline. Commander Eugene Fluckey gave the order. The deck crew moved swiftly, lowering 2 small rubber boats into the black water. In them were packed the chosen raiders, the 8 volunteers who carried the bomb, their paddles, and their courage. They had rehearsed this moment for days, but now it was real. Every sound felt amplified, the creak of the davits, the slosh of water against the hull, even the soft thud of boots against rubber. One by one, the sailors climbed down and took their places, faces streaked with grease to dull their pale skin. They looked less like submariners and more like shadows preparing to vanish into the surf. At the stern, Billy Hatfield cradled the explosive device, wrapped in canvas, its wires tucked carefully away. The men took up their paddles. With a final nod from their commander, they pushed off, leaving the submarine behind. The Barb drifted quietly offshore, her engines idling low. On deck, lookouts scanned the horizon for signs of Japanese patrol craft or searchlights. Any alarm raised now would doom the raiding party. In the small boats, the men bent to their work, paddling steadily but silently. The water was cold, the salt air sharp in their lungs. Overhead, stars glimmered faintly through thin clouds, offering just enough light to guide their way. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The beach drew closer, first a darker smear against the water, then the faint shape of trees, yaos, and dunes. The surf grew louder, crashing softly on the sand. The sailors grounded their boats, dragging them ashore with as little noise as possible. Every footstep seemed deafening in their own ears. Once ashore, they crouched low, listening. The night was filled with small sounds, the wind in the grass, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird. From far inland came another noise, the faint rumble of a locomotive, steel wheels grinding along the tracks. It was a reminder of their purpose, and of the danger waiting only a few hundred yards away. The men divided into pairs. 2 carried the bomb, heavy but manageable, its weight pulling at their arms as they crept inland. 2 acted as lookouts, scanning the tree line for signs of movement. The others cleared the way, pushing through the tall grass that brushed against their uniforms. They moved slowly, their senses straining. A barking dog from a distant farmhouse froze them in place, hearts pounding, until silence returned. At last, the dark silhouette of the railway emerged ahead. Twin steel rails, glinting faintly in the starlight, stretched into the distance. The men dropped to their bellies and crawled forward, careful not to disturb the ballast stones that crunched beneath them. Reaching the line, they set down their burden. Time was critical now. Billy Hatfield and Edward Klingler went to work on the device. They dug a shallow bed between the ties, sliding the explosive charge into place. Wires were checked, the wooden trigger board aligned across the rails, and ballast scattered to conceal their handiwork. The men worked quickly, their hands steady despite the tension that knotted their stomachs. A single flashlight, shielded by a rag, cast the faintest glow to guide them. Every few seconds the raiders froze, ears straining at imagined footsteps or distant noises. A whistle in the night made them glance sharply down the tracks. A train was coming, though still far away. They moved faster, tightening the final connections, pressing ballast over the planks until the device blended into the shadows of the track bed. When the last nail was hammered in and the wires hidden, the team withdrew. They crawled back the way they had come, inch by inch, until the grass swallowed them again. Only when they reached the relative cover of the dunes did they rise to their feet. The bomb was set. All they could do now was pray the passing locomotive would trigger it. But the mission was only half complete. They still had to return to the beach, launch their boats, and make it back to the submarine without being seen. Moving in silence, they retraced their steps, carrying paddles and gear. Their eyes flicked constantly toward the shoreline, half expecting to see lanterns or hear the challenge of Japanese sentries. Yet the coast remained still, as though unaware that enemy sailors walked upon it. At the beach, the rubber boats waited, half hidden in the sand. The raiders shoved them back into the surf, wading waist-deep before climbing in. Paddles dipped quietly, propelling them back into the black expanse of the sea. Behind them, the coast of Karafuto disappeared into shadow. Ahead, the faint silhouette of the USS Barb loomed like a guardian in the night. As they drew near, hands reached down to haul them aboard. The raiders clambered up, wet and exhausted, but grinning through their grease-blackened faces. They had planted the bomb undetected. Now came the hardest part, waiting. On deck, the men crowded near the conning tower, binoculars trained on the shore. The submarine drifted silently, her engines quiet, her crew holding its collective breath. Somewhere inland, a locomotive was approaching, its rumble faint across the water. The device lay ready, hidden beneath the rails. The raiding party, soaked to the bone and shivering, watched the dark coastline, their hearts pounding in anticipation. They had survived the landing, crept across enemy soil, and planted their explosive. Whether it would succeed or fail, whether the Japanese would ever know how close they had come to discovery, would be decided in the next moments. For now, the USS Barb floated unseen on the waters of Karafuto, a single American submarine daring to strike directly at the Empire's homeland. 8 sailors had done the unthinkable. They had set foot on Japanese soil and returned alive. What remained was to see if their mission would achieve the spectacular finale their commander envisioned. The men of the USS Barb stood silently on deck, their eyes fixed on the dark coastline of Karafuto. The rubber boats had been hauled back aboard. The raiders had returned, wet and breathless, and the submarine drifted quietly offshore with engines idled low. Now came the waiting, the longest, most agonizing minutes of the entire operation. From far inland came the faint, rhythmic rumble of steel on steel. A locomotive was approaching. The sound carried over the water, distant at first, then gradually louder, as though the very earth were trembling. The raiders leaned against the conning tower, still dripping from the surf, their hearts pounding in their chests. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay their handiwork, the pressure-triggered bomb concealed between the rails. If it failed, the mission would end as nothing more than a daring footnote. If it succeeded, history would be made. The whistle of the locomotive pierced the night. Through binoculars, faint lights appeared along the tracks, growing brighter as the train drew nearer. It was a freight train, long, heavy, its engine dragging a line of cars filled with cargo bound southward. The sailors held their breath. The locomotive barreled on, its headlamp cutting a narrow beam into the darkness, wheels hammering the rails at full speed. And then it happened. A flash of white light erupted beneath the locomotive, followed by a thunderous roar that split the night. The earth shook with the concussion. The train seemed to leap upward, as though wrenched by some unseen force, before crashing down in a spray of sparks and twisted steel. The engine pitched sideways, dragging cars off the rails. Boxcars buckled, toppling into one another like toys, some erupting in fire as their contents ignited. Flames licked skyward, lighting the coastline in an orange glow visible for miles. The sound rolled across the water, reaching the submarine with a deep, resonant boom. On the Barb's deck, jubilation erupted. Men who had been silent now shouted and cheered, pumping their fists into the air. The raiders grinned, their exhaustion forgotten, as they watched the fiery wreckage consume the train. Commander Flucky himself, usually composed even in victory, allowed himself a rare smile. The mission had not only succeeded, it had surpassed all expectations. On shore, chaos reigned. Villagers, jolted from sleep by the explosion, poured into the streets. Some rushed toward the flames, calling out to loved ones who had been aboard the train. Japanese railway guards scrambled to the wreckage, their lanterns bobbing in the darkness. The screams of the injured mingled with the roar of fire, creating a scene of panic and confusion. To the stunned onlookers, there was no question. This was sabotage. But how could the enemy have reached them? Japan's homeland had been struck, not from the air, not from the sea, but from the ground itself. For the Americans offshore, the spectacle was almost surreal. From the safety of the submarine, they watched their small act of sabotage reverberate across the enemy's consciousness. One train destroyed would not alter the course of the war, but its symbolism was enormous. The Japanese had been assured that their soil was inviolate, that no enemy soldier could set foot upon it. Now that myth was in flames before their very eyes. As the fire burned and the wreckage smoldered, the Barb slowly slipped back beneath the waves, vanishing into the darkness from which she had come. On board, the crew's jubilation gave way to quiet pride. They had achieved what no other American force had managed during the war, a successful ground raid on the Japanese homeland. In the cramped compartments of the submarine, sailors spoke in hushed, awed tones of the moment they had witnessed, replaying the blast in their masts as they prepared to resume their patrol. For Commander Eugene Flucky, the destruction of the train was not measured in tonnage or tactical effect. It was measured in morale, in symbolism, and in the audacity of his men. "We didn't just sink ships," he would later remark. "We shook the enemy's confidence in his own soil." And in that July night of 1945, the wreckage of a single Japanese locomotive testified to the fact that the war had truly reached every corner of the empire. No place was safe, no frontier untouched. The Americans had landed, struck, and escaped, and Japan, already teetering on the edge of defeat, had been dealt yet another psychological blow. The explosion still echoed faintly across the water as the USS Barb eased back into the darkness. The submarine's engines hummed low, her bow pointed toward open sea. On shore, chaos unfolded around the burning wreckage of the train. Lanterns bobbed in hurried clusters as villagers, soldiers, and railway officials rushed to the scene. Within minutes, the Japanese garrison had been alerted. Telephone lines crackled with frantic reports. A train destroyed, sabotage suspected, foreigners possibly involved. Orders flew to coastal patrols, to lookouts along the beaches, and to every battery commander within reach. Flucky knew what was coming. For all the jubilation aboard the Barb, the danger was far from over. Japanese coastal defenses might be thin compared to the south, but they were not absent. Shore batteries guarded harbors, patrol boats prowled the inlets, and above them all, aircraft based on Hokkaido could be scrambled at dawn. If the submarine lingered too close to shore, she risked entrapment and destruction. The Barb had to vanish before the enemy could mount a response. He ordered flank speed, the diesel engines driving the boat forward as she slipped away from the coastline. Yet speed had its price. Noise. Japanese hydrophones could detect the thrum of propellers. Flucky alternated between bursts of speed and periods of near silence, carefully threading the submarine into deeper waters. Lookouts scanned for silhouettes on the horizon, their ears straining for the faint hum of patrol boats. By 0200 hours, the search was underway. Shore stations fired flares skyward, their white light casting fleeting brilliance over the sea. Patrol craft left harbor, their engines beating against the waves. For the men on the Barb, every flare was a potential death sentence, every shadow a hunter. Inside the boat, silence was enforced. Even conversations were hushed, as though human voices might somehow betray their position. Below decks, the crew balanced exhilaration with fatigue. The 8 raiders sat drying their clothes, still grinning despite exhaustion. Others congratulated them quietly, shaking hands, offering tin cups of lukewarm coffee. They had achieved what no Americans had before them, a successful ground raid on Japanese soil, but none allowed themselves the luxury of celebration for long. The memory of depth-charge barrages in earlier patrols was too fresh. They knew how quickly triumph could turn to terror. At 0300 hours, sonar detected the faint pings of Japanese searchers. The Barb dove, her ballast tanks flooding as she slid beneath the surface. At 150 feet, she leveled off, running quietly on electric motors. The submarine became a shadow within the sea, her men listening to the distant thuds of enemy patrol boats above. Each ping was a question cast into the deep. "Are you here?" Each minute of silence was an answer. "Not tonight." For hours, the cat-and-mouse game continued. The Japanese, convinced that saboteurs had landed from the sea, swept the coastal waters. Depth charges fell in sporadic patterns, their explosions rumbling through the hull, rattling pipes and nerves alike. Yet none were close. The Barb, guided by Flucky's steady hand, evaded with practiced skill. He relied on speed when gaps appeared, then reduced to silent running when danger grew near. It was a dance the submarine crews of the Pacific had perfected, one that demanded patience, discipline, and luck. By dawn, the threat began to subside. Patrol boats lingered near the shore, guarding the beaches and scouring coves, but they no longer pressed into the deeper waters where the Barb now prowled. The submarine surfaced briefly, her periscope scanning the empty horizon. No aircraft yet stirred in the skies. With daylight rising, Flucky turned his boat eastward, putting miles between them and the shattered railway. Only then did the tension truly ease. In the cramped mess compartment, sailors allowed themselves weary laughter, recounting the raid in whispers and hand gestures. The 8 raiders, still drying out their uniforms, received pats on the back and good-natured ribbing. "First Americans ashore in Japan," one man said with pride. Another added, "and the first to blow up a train while they were at it." Strategically, the effect of the mission was small. One train destroyed could not cripple Japan's logistics, but psychologically, the impact was enormous. For the Japanese, the raid shattered the illusion of security in Karafuto. For the Americans, it proved that even at the twilight of war, ingenuity and daring could achieve results that resonated far beyond their immediate target. As the Barb slipped farther into the Pacific, her crew carried with them the knowledge that they had written a singular chapter in naval history. They had faced the danger, struck boldly, and escaped the net cast in their wake. Japan had been forced to reckon with the fact that nowhere, not even the home islands, was truly safe. When the USS Barb returned from her 12th patrol, she carried with her not only the tonnage of ships sunk and convoys scattered, but also a singular story that would echo far beyond the war itself. The destruction of the Karafuto train, an act carried out by 8 sailors armed with a homemade bomb and nerves of steel, stood apart from the conventional record of submarine warfare. It was not the largest blow struck, nor the deadliest, but it was one of the boldest. For Commander Eugene B. Flucky, recognition had already come. Earlier that year, for his daring penetration of Namquan Harbor and the destruction of a convoy under the guns of shore batteries, he had received the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest decoration for valor. His reputation was secure. Yet the Karafuto raid elevated him and his crew into legend. They had accomplished what no other American unit had done, a ground operation on the Japanese homeland. The Navy quickly took note. The official patrol report, submitted after the Barb's return, detailed the sinking of enemy shipping, shore bombardments, and the destruction of the train. The phrase, "one locomotive destroyed," would be added to the submarine's battle flag, stitched alongside symbols for ships sunk and targets bombarded. It was a small icon, yet one that carried immense symbolic weight. Submarine crews prided themselves on their tallies, but the Barb's flag bore an emblem no other could claim. Within the submarine force, the raid became a story retold with pride and a hint of disbelief. Sailors who served under different commands spoke of it in mess halls and shore stations, how Lucky Flucky had landed his men, how they had crept inland, and how a train had been blown off the tracks in flames. In a service already famed for audacity, this feat seemed to surpass imagination. Beyond the Navy, the tale reached into the wider military community. As the Cold War dawned in the years after 1945, strategists studied the raid as an example of what submarines might achieve beyond torpedo attacks. The concept of submarine-delivered commandos, or frogmen, gained traction. In later decades, nuclear submarines would carry SEAL teams, deploy covert raiders, and conduct clandestine operations along hostile shores. The seed of those doctrines, many noted, lay in the night raid of July 23, 1945. For the men of the Barb, the memory was personal. Many spoke of it not with bravado, but with quiet pride. Billy Hatfield, one of the raiders, later recalled the eerie silence of the night, the creak of the wooden triggerboard under his hands, and the distant whistle of the train drawing closer. To him, it had felt less like heroism than duty. Others remembered the nervous laughter that rippled through the group as they paddled back to the submarine, half wondering if the device would even work. Their relief when the explosion lit the coastline and the locomotive careened from the tracks was matched only by the exhilaration of survival. The raid's legacy was not only military, but cultural. Newspapers after the war recounted the episode with relish, presenting it as proof of American daring and ingenuity. "Submarine lands commandos, wrecks train on Japanese soil," read one headline. To a public weary of casualty reports and grim battles, the story offered a moment of audacious triumph, a tale in which a handful of young sailors had humbled the enemy on his own ground. Yet Flucky himself resisted exaggeration. In his memoirs, he wrote of the raid with characteristic understatement, noting that while the destruction of the train had little tactical impact, it carried immense psychological weight. For him, the true legacy of the operation lay in the spirit it embodied, the willingness to innovate, to take risks, and to trust in the skill and courage of ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things. The USS Barb ended the war with an unmatched record. Over her 12 patrols, she sank 17 enemy ships totaling nearly 97,000 tons, damaged many more, shelled shore installations, and conducted the only American ground combat mission on Japanese soil. Her battle flag bristled with symbols, merchantmen, tankers, warships, and one lone locomotive. When she returned from her final patrol, she did so as one of the most decorated submarines in U.S. history. For the submarine service, the raid on Karafuto remains a moment of singular pride. It demonstrated that even in the final days of a long and brutal conflict, imagination could carve out new ways to strike the enemy. It foreshadowed the age of unconventional warfare that would dominate much of the latter 20th century, and it ensured that the name Barb and that of her commander Eugene Lucky Flucky would be remembered wherever stories of naval daring are told. In the end, the raid's significance cannot be measured in tons destroyed or trains derailed. It must be measured in symbolism. In a war of massive fleets and strategic bombing campaigns, a single locomotive may seem trivial, but for Japan, it was proof that the homeland itself was vulnerable. And for the Americans, it was proof that courage and creativity could carry the fight into the most unlikely places. In the hours after the explosion of July 23, 1945, confusion reigned along the railway of Karafuto. Japanese railway guards and soldiers scrambled to the wreckage, their lanterns swaying against the glare of burning freight cars. The twisted metal of the locomotive still smoked, while cries of the injured mingled with the crackling of fire. To the villagers who gathered, there was no question that something extraordinary had occurred. Accidents could derail trains, but accidents did not blast craters into the earth. Someone had planted a bomb. Someone had struck from the shadows. For the Japanese authorities, the implications were intolerable. The home islands were supposed to be inviolate, shielded by the sea and by the vigilance of the Imperial Army and Navy. Yet here, in the northern reaches of Karafuto, an American hand had reached across the Pacific and torn away that illusion. Patrols fanned out across the beaches, soldiers combed the coastline, and local police interrogated villagers for any sign of foreign infiltration. But there was nothing to find. The men of the USS Barb had already vanished back into the sea, leaving behind only wreckage and questions. The government in Tokyo faced a dilemma. News of the sabotage could not be allowed to spread unchecked. If civilians across Japan learned that American soldiers had landed on their soil, panic could follow. The propaganda machinery of the imperial government, already stretched thin by the firebombings and the relentless toll of war, moved swiftly to contain the story. Official bulletins minimized the event, framing it as a minor accident on the Karafuto line. Newspapers received strict orders not to exaggerate the incident. Military censors ensured that no whispers of foreign commandos reached the wider public. And yet, suppression could not erase reality. In Karafuto itself, word spread quickly. Villagers who had seen the explosion with their own eyes told neighbors and relatives. Survivors from the train spoke in hushed voices of sabotage, of foreign hands on the soil of Japan. Even without official confirmation, rumors circulated through markets, schools, and workplaces. They mingled with the broader unease already gripping the nation. The cities in ashes, the navy sunk, the army retreating. Now came a new fear, that the Americans could land at will, strike unseen, and disappear again into the night. For ordinary Japanese civilians, the destroyed train became another symbol of vulnerability. They had long endured the terror of B-29 raids, the distant thunder of naval bombardments, the rationing and shortages that eroded daily life. But those threats came from afar, delivered from skies or seas. This was different. This was proof that the enemy had set foot on Japanese earth. The psychological impact was profound. If the North could be breached, if Karafuto could be touched, what of Hokkaido or even Honshu itself? Among the military establishment, the raid was seen as a humiliation. Commanders tasked with defending the coastline demanded explanations. How had American saboteurs landed without detection? Where had the coastal patrols been? Why had the railway not been better guarded? Yet answers were elusive. Japan's resources were stretched to the breaking point, its forces scattered and exhausted. The reality was harsh. The empire no longer had the capacity to defend every shoreline, every track, every village. The timing of the raid made its symbolism even sharper. In July 1945, Japan was already standing on the precipice. The Battle of Okinawa had ended in catastrophic defeat just weeks earlier. American bombers incinerated city after city. The Navy was a ghost of its former self, fuel gone, ships rusting in port, and in secret, across the Pacific, 2 atomic weapons waited to be unleashed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To a nation already bracing for the unimaginable, the destruction of a single train in Karafuto may have seemed small. Yet in the context of collapse, it was one more sign that the war was lost. Indeed, the raid on Karafuto illustrated with stark clarity the unraveling of Japan's defenses. No fortress was unbreachable, no frontier safe. It showed that the homeland was porous, that American forces could innovate in ways the Japanese had not anticipated. The very idea that sailors from a submarine, ordinary crewmen, not elite commandos, could land, strike, and escape revealed the impotence of Japan's defensive posture. For the Allies, the psychological effect was no less important. The USS Barb's action was celebrated within the submarine fleet as a testament to ingenuity and daring. Strategists recognized that the sabotage itself had little material impact, but the symbolism was immense. It proved that America's reach was total, that even Japan's most guarded assumptions of safety could be violated. And for the men of the Barb, the sight of that locomotive exploding into fire stood as proof that their mission had not been in vain. In retrospect, the Karafuto raid can be seen as a microcosm of Japan's broader defeat. The empire had relied on the belief that geography offered protection, that the sea was a moat against invasion. Yet the moat had been crossed. Submarines prowled unchallenged, bombers roared overhead, and now commandos had walked upon the homeland itself. The psychological barrier had been broken. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, the devastation was overwhelming. Entire cities were obliterated in moments. Yet even before those apocalyptic strikes, the cracks in Japan's defenses were visible everywhere, from the burned ruins of Tokyo to the shattered wreckage of a train in Karafuto. The raid by the USS Barb was not decisive in itself, but it was emblematic of a truth the Japanese leadership could no longer ignore. Their ability to defend the homeland was gone. In the final weeks before surrender, as Emperor Hirohito weighed the unbearable decision to end the war, stories like the Karafuto sabotage carried significance. They underscored the inevitability of defeat, the futility of further resistance, the impossibility of securing the nation's borders. America had landed, struck, and escaped unpunished. The empire was vulnerable, and the end was near. Thus, the train sabotage endures not as a tactical triumph, but as a symbol. For the Japanese, it was a shock, a humiliation, a reminder that the homeland was already breached. For the Americans, it was proof of ingenuity and daring at the twilight of war. And for history, it remains a small but vivid chapter in the story of Japan's symbolic defeat, a moment when fire on a northern rail line mirrored the larger collapse of an empire in its final summer. In the weeks that followed the destruction of the Karafuto train, the USS Barb remained at sea, continuing her 12th and final war patrol. The submarine hunted Japanese shipping with the same aggressiveness that had marked all her voyages. But by late July and August 1945, there was little left to find. The once crowded lanes of merchant convoys were nearly empty, the Japanese merchant fleet annihilated by 3 years of relentless submarine warfare. The ocean, once a battleground of escorts and convoys, had become a graveyard of silence. For the men of the Barb, the raid ashore was never far from conversation. Between dives and surfacings, between routine drills and the long monotony of patrol, the raiders replayed every moment. The cold surf at their ankles, the creak of the trigger board, the whistle of the train in the distance. Their shipmates listened with awe, repeating the tale like a legend already being born. On the submarine's battle flag, a new symbol appeared, stitched not in the form of a ship, but of a locomotive. No other American submarine could boast such an emblem. Then, in August 1945, history overtook them all. On the 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki met the same fate. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive into Manchuria, sweeping aside Japanese defenses in days. And on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across Japanese radios, announcing surrender. For the first time in history, the emperor spoke directly to his people. His words confirmed what many already knew: the war was over. Aboard the Barb, the announcement was met with a mix of relief, disbelief, and quiet reflection. Some cheered, some wept, and some simply sat in silence, thinking of shipmates lost and of the long years that had passed since Pearl Harbor. They had fought in the shadows, beneath the waves, and now, at last, the killing had ended. The submarine turned for home, her 12th patrol complete, her war finished. The Barb returned to the United States draped in honors. Over her career, she had sunk 17 ships totaling nearly 97,000 tons, shelled enemy installations, and conducted the only American ground raid on the Japanese homeland. Her commander, Eugene B. Fluckey, already a recipient of the Medal of Honor, added 4 Navy Crosses to his record, making him one of the most decorated submarine officers in U.S. history. To his men, however, his greatest achievement was not medals, but the fact that he had brought them home alive. Remarkably, during Fluckey's command, not a single man of the Barb was lost in combat. In the years after the war, the memory of the Karafuto raid endured. Sailors told it in bars and reunions. Historians recorded it in naval chronicles, and the submarine's battle flag preserved its legacy with that single stitched locomotive. What had been, in tactical terms, a minor sabotage became, in cultural terms, a legend, proof of American ingenuity and daring in the final desperate summer of the Pacific War. Fluckey himself continued to serve, rising to the rank of Rear Admiral before retiring. In civilian life, he remained the same mixture of modesty and daring that had defined his wartime career. When asked about the raid, he often downplayed his own role, giving credit to the men who had paddled ashore that night. It was their courage that made it possible, he would say. To the end of his life, he insisted that leadership was about trust, trusting his men, and earning their trust in return. The crew of the Barb went on to live their lives in peacetime. Some returned to small towns and farms. Others pursued careers in business or trades. At reunions decades later, they spoke of their shared experiences with the bond of men who had survived the crucible of war together. And always, the story of the train raid was told, half with laughter, half with reverence. It was the moment when they had stepped out of the shadows of the sea and onto the enemy's soil, leaving behind twisted rails and a scar on the enemy's pride. For historians, the raid foreshadowed the future of naval warfare. In the Cold War, submarines would carry special forces, insert commandos, and conduct covert operations along hostile shores. What the Barb did in July 1945 with rubber boats and improvised explosives, nuclear submarines would later do with mini-subs, SEAL teams, and advanced technology. The principle was the same: stealth, surprise, and the ability to strike where the enemy least expected it. And for the Japanese, the memory of that night lingered in local folklore. In Karafuto, lost to the Soviet Union after the war, stories were told of the night the rails exploded, of the villagers who rushed to the scene, of the humiliation that even in their homeland, the Americans had come. In the collective memory of the war, it became one more sign of the inevitable, one more reminder that the Empire had been doomed long before the surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri. Today, the story of the USS Barb and her raiders remains a testament to the human elements of war: courage, ingenuity, and the willingness to risk everything for a mission that mattered less for its physical damage than for its symbolism. The image endures: 8 young sailors crawling through the grass of a Japanese island, planting a bomb beneath the rails, and slipping back into the sea. The explosion that followed was not just the destruction of a train, it was the collapse of an illusion. As the documentary closes, the rails of Karafuto are shown in imagination once more, twisted metal gleaming faintly in the light of fire, smoke curling into the night sky, villagers staring in shock. A small act of sabotage, yes, but one that carried enormous symbolic weight. It reminds us that wars are not only won with fleets and armies, but also with daring, imagination, and the human courage to step ashore when no one expects it. The USS Barb ended her war with ships sunk, ports bombarded, and one locomotive destroyed. But in that single act on a dark shoreline, she and her crew carved a place in history that no statistics could capture. It was a final reminder that even in the last desperate months of World War II, ingenuity and audacity could still shape the story of victory.